Thank you so much, Margie. Just a reminder, we are getting many questions at this point. We want you to keep the questions coming. We are putting them into thematic areas, if you will, and we will answer as many questions as we can today, but we will follow up on CERC's website with answers to the questions, or, I guess I should say, and/or, some of these may appear as an expanded FAQ from the State Department of Education. So with that in mind, the question that is coming the most has to do with, once again, who can diagnose a specific learning disability / dyslexia. So we're going to turn it back to Jewel, and Pat may join in.
Okay. So it's important to remember that when we're talking about dyslexia, dyslexia is a specific learning disability. If you'll notice in your LD guidelines, there's discussion about who can diagnose specific learning disability. And there's an FAQ handout that you can find on the State Department website and also on CERC's website that speak to the issue of who can identify a child with specific learning disability / dyslexia. I'm going to allow Pat to talk just a little bit about what it is that the State Department has to say regarding the identification of dyslexia.
First of all, thanks, Jill. First of all, we would prefer to use the term identify, which is the educational term, as opposed to diagnose, which tends to be more of a medical term, and dyslexia is not considered a medical disability. It is considered a difficulty in the educational area of reading, for example. So under IDEA, it is the planning and placement team that ultimately identifies a child as having dyslexia. And dyslexia is a subcategory of a specific learning disability. School districts, many different types of people in school districts are qualified to identify a child as having a learning disability, including school psychologists, speech and language professionals, with input from other areas such as reading. So anyone who has the training and background to identify a specific learning disability and can look at all of those components of reading is qualified to identify a child as having dyslexia.
And so, Pat, as a follow-up to that question, the question has come through from several people. If a family does not agree with the school's assessment of their student in terms of the identification of SLD or SLD dyslexia, what would they do? What are parents' rights?
In terms of any child with a disability, whenever a family does not agree with the identification of a child or the non-identification of a child, under their rights, they have the right to request an outside evaluation at the expense of a district. The district then has two choices. They can either work with the family to get an outside evaluation, or they can request a mediation or a hearing to present their side of the story as to why the child has a different identification or is not identified as a child with a disability. And all of that is spelled out in the Parent's Guide to Special Education and the procedural safeguards that each family receives prior to a referral or an evaluation of a child.
Thank you, Pat. Another topic of questions has to do with really what is a decoding issue for students. We're talking about a core phonological deficit, and a little bit more information about what this actually is, and are we really talking about eligibility criteria for this? So Jewel, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. So we had a question come in about what the difference is between a learning disability in dyslexia versus a learning disability in decoding. And it's important to remember to go back to those initial slides that when we're talking about a student with dyslexia, that's a student who has a core phonological processing deficit that's been identified. When we're talking about phonological processing, we're looking really at one of three areas. We're either looking at phonological awareness deficits, or we're looking at rapid naming deficits, or we're looking at something called working memory deficits that are phonologically based. So for a student to have an identification of dyslexia under that specific learning disability category, you need to have evidence of a core phonological processing deficit at one of those levels. You may have students who present with significant decoding deficits who are at the level of disability, but who are not dyslexic. Okay? You may also have students who have significant decoding disabilities or decoding issues who are not dyslexic for reasons like maybe they've had inappropriate instruction, right? So if you've had a student who has not received appropriate instruction, either because of interruptions in the schooling or just a general lack of appropriate instruction provided to the student, lack of explicit systematic instruction, etc., the presentation of the decoding issues would not be attributable necessarily to dyslexia. So the important thing to keep in mind is that for a student to have the identification of dyslexia, there needs to be the evidence of the core phonological processing deficit. It's also important to keep in mind that the overwhelming majority of your students with specific learning disability likely have that flag or that indicator.
We do have a number of questions that are coming through about our high school students, and in terms of both the assessment or identification process and intervention. So either Margie or Jewel, we'll turn it over to you to chat a little bit about high school students.
So Margie, if I can start just with some generics, and maybe you can fill in for folks around the implementation for instruction. It's really important that for high school students, you develop an intervention plan for them that includes sufficiently intensive, targeted remedial interventions. Even though they're in high school, we're talking about students who still need to have time carved out to receive the remedial interventions that are warranted based on the results of their diagnostic assessments. The interventions really should be delivered by an appropriately trained and supported interventionist. And when we're talking about interventions, I'm not talking necessarily about a packaged program. You may opt instead for an approach like Orton Gillingham. What's important in terms of the remedial interventions is that they're systematic and they're explicit in nature and that they're direct. So systematic, explicit, direct instruction is what's necessary for these students. High school students and all students, in my opinion, really should have a complementary progress monitoring plan in place, even if they're students who are identified and have an IEP. Progress monitoring plan will help to ensure that the instruction that's happening in special education is meaningful for the student and the student is making meaningful progress. Third would be to ensure that you've considered an accommodation plan for the student. Accommodations should not replace remediation, but you will need to make sure, for example, that considerations such as extended time or access to a computer are in place for the student and that the team is appropriately trained and informed about the student's accommodation plan. Finally, a consideration for assistive technology for the student, which may warrant an assistive technology evaluation so that technology can be used as a resource to help the student to access text, again, but not to replace skill building that's happening for the student. And again, sorry, last but not least, transition planning considerations for the student in high school. What does the student's disability currently mean for their transition planning needs as they're moving forward toward postgraduate experiences?
Covered it beautifully.
That's great. Pat, did you want to add anything? Jewel ended with transition planning, specifically for these students. Any words of wisdom for us?
No, I think the major thing is that dyslexia or a specific learning disability are not something that goes away, and when the student is moving either to an employment setting and or to a college setting, there are additional pressures and needs that they're going to have. Even if they have improved their ability to read, the amount of information, the volume of information, and the type of information is probably going to warrant some assistive technology. So that is probably one of the primary areas that needs to be looked at when moving post-high school.
Thank you, Pat. Another topic that's coming through as a broad question is this notion of, does the identification of dyslexia automatically mean that the student is has poor reading comprehension? So Jewel is going to kick us off with responding to that question.
I'm going to start, and then I hope Margie will join in at the end to talk a little bit about the different types of task demands associated with comprehension. So whether or not a student with dyslexia experiences difficulty with reading comprehension really depends upon how comprehension is assessed. So task demands associated with reading comprehension will really a student's performance. For example, if you have the student who's expected to engage in a maze task, and if the maze task isn't timed, you may find that comprehension looks healthy for that student if they have adequate time. If you add a timing component to the maze task, what you may find is that comprehension looks like it's suffering because the student wasn't able to finish enough items in the maze. But if you look more closely, you might find that of the items attempted, the student earned a very strong percentage correct. So brief assessments of reading comprehension might not signal a poor reading comprehension profile. However, comprehension with authentic text demands will characteristically suffer. So when text becomes longer, or you start to see the presence of disciplinary vocabulary, you add to that a slow rate of reading, poor prosody, and impacted decoding, and poor reading vocabulary, then you're often to see poor comprehension. And so what characteristically happens with our kids with dyslexia when they receive the longer reading tasks is they're either skimming, or hopefully they're using technology to support them in order to bolster comprehension. But most often, if they're independent with the reading task, you're going to see the student avoid the longer reading task. So again, comprehension depends on the task demand, and if the task demand is authentic in nature, like what happens in our classrooms, reading and responding, you're likely to see the impact of dyslexia.
Margie, just a couple things. One, for those of you who don't know what a maze is, it's a closed task. So you have usually every seventh word is omitted, and the student has to choose the correct words to fill in the blanks. I think Jewel's point is very well taken. I think, or points I should say, one of the things that you can do to determine what the student's comprehension skills are is you can administer a comprehension task. You can read a story or read a passage to the student and ask questions and see how they perform at an oral level. So then you're truly measuring language comprehension, as I spoke about earlier, versus having them read the passage and then answer the questions. And you'll see how well correlated those two tasks are. And if it turns out that their language comprehension is very good, then you know that it's probably the decoding that's causing major problems for them. However, if you see that language comprehension is also suffering, which, as I spoke about earlier, often happens because these children are not reading. That's why it's really important that you read to them. They listen to stories. They listen to text. There's great technology now available to do that. Bookshare has books available. So there's lots of opportunities for students to listen to text, and they need to hear it if they're not reading it themselves, because that will expose them to content knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, and at least continue to support their comprehension skills.
Thank you, Margie. And your final reference there was to the whole array of assistive technology tools that are available to students. We have gotten some specific questions about students, in particular in grades 6 through 12, and what types of assistive technology tools might be most helpful for them in terms of their reading and their writing. So turn it back over to either Jewel or Margie.
As I mentioned, Bookshare is a great resource because it provides books on tape. There's lots of software programs that help with students' ability to convey what they want to say, specifically for writing. That is an area of weakness, like I said, for most students. So the use of software, I think for that, just learning more about, there's so much out there, I can't honestly keep up with all of it. But having an assistive technology eval is a good idea, because it then exposes students to the technology, and what it does is it shows what they respond to, what they need, what works for them, and that's really, as Jewel mentioned, should be an important component of the intervention that they receive, not as a remediation tool, but as an accommodation.
I would concur with you, Margie. This is Jewel. That assistive technology, in my opinion, should promote access to text, but it really should not be a replacement for direct, explicit remedial instruction. And that's important for teams to keep in mind, that we don't want to warehouse children or students on technology. What's most important for these students is that they have a knowledgeable, skilled teacher delivering and monitoring interventions.
Thank you, Jewel and Margie. And that also highlights the point that was made before about the identification of a student with a specific learning disability or dyslexia really requires a team. So we need people on these teams who have that knowledge base in AT and can bring forth those suggestions that are appropriate for individual students. The last question we have for this segment has to do with eligibility criteria. And just to remind everyone that we will have more answers to more questions as we go on, but I'm going to turn this over to Pat to address that.
Thank you. I'm going to start this with one of the other questions that asked about whether Connecticut's dyslexic law is focused only on the phonological aspect of dyslexia. And dyslexia, as you may have gathered, is a very complex issue, and there are many different types of profiles. And as we continue with our professional development in this area, we will get more and more into case studies and different kinds of profiles. But this is the predominant area. And in addition to that, specific learning disabilities, which has been around a while, there are many concerns around that area, both students who have reading difficulties as well as math difficulties and writing difficulties, and the impact that has on behavior, both in and out of the classroom. So we are appreciative that this law on dyslexia is helping to raise our awareness for all children with specific learning disabilities, but also specifically to reach those students who have trouble with the phonological processing. To that end, people have asked, what are the eligibility criteria? As you will notice in the IEP manual, the eligibility criteria that have to be met are for a specific learning disability initially, and then the information that has been presented this morning and in the CSDE's working definition of dyslexia that's presented both in the IEP manual and in the frequently asked questions. Another question that was received today and I have had before is the department going to create a checklist of criteria for a child with dyslexia? Since there is no one dyslexia profile, and you have to look at each child's individual strengths and weaknesses and develop an individual evaluation, there is no one checklist that can be developed for any child who might have dyslexia. You can certainly consider the red flags, as Jewel highlighted earlier, and certainly all of the areas of reading instruction, particularly phonological processing, particularly areas like reading nonsense words, are very key areas for further exploration, but there is not going to be a checklist developed for dyslexia.
Thank you, Pat. And one of the things you alluded to is that this really is a complex topic. And the intended outcome that we have for this webinar is to increase awareness of this topic, SLD and dyslexia. And since it is complex, we anticipate that we will be able to provide additional professional learning opportunities in the near future and into the 2015-16 school year and beyond. So stay tuned, and we will loop you into those.